Hello, I'm Nahat Kerala, and welcome to a new episode of the Organized Chaos podcast, the show that is dedicated to helping startups scale from 7 to 9 figures by turning HR into rocket fuel for their growth. Most startup founders I talk to are convinced that they are great at hiring. They say things like, I know talent when I see it, or I trust my gut. And yet, according to studies by Leadership IQ and other management consultants, the majority of business failures are linked to people-related issues. For instance, 89% of new hires fail due to attitude and behavioral issues, not a lack of skill. Think about that for a minute. If you're a founder scaling a company from 7 to 9 figures, a single bad hire, especially in a critical role like B2B sales, for example, can cost you 5 times their annual salary in lost deals, training costs, and team disruption. This is chaos, not organization. The truth is, if you are relying on unstructured interviews, that friendly chat, the coffee meeting, the tell me about yourself questions, you're doing nothing more than flipping a coin. Research by Schmidt and Hunter shows that those traditional interviews are only 14% better at predicting job success than random chance. But there is a solution. It's a proven, research-backed framework that turns interviews from a coin flip into a predictable, data-driven system. It is how high-growth companies like Google and Amazon built their talent pipeline and still do to this day. Today, I'm going to walk you through the 6-step framework to build this system, starting with the foundation of identifying the right skills. And stick around until the end, because I'll be sharing an AI-powered interview question builder that automatically identifies competencies and generates questions based on the exact techniques I'm about to share, all from an existing job description. This is one of the keys to turning HR into rocket fuel for your growth. And if you haven't done so already, please follow the podcast to get notified whenever I release any new episodes. So let's start with step 1, which is the importance of structured questions. Let's get one thing straight. The interview is not a conversation. It is a data collection process. When you're building a product, you use a set of standardized tests to check quality. You don't just casually ask, hey, how's the server speed today? Hiring should be no different. A structured interview ensures you collect the exact same measurable data point from every single candidate. Unstructured interviews are prone to human bias. The affinity bias, which is liking someone because they went to the same school as you, for example, or maybe the halo effect, which is something like letting one impressive trait really cloud your judgment, or something like recency bias, where remembering the last person you spoke to the most clearly is what drives your decision. These biases lead to hiring people you like, but who are not actually equipped to perform. For a scaling startup, every new hire has an outsized impact. You cannot afford an emotional decision. So structured interviews dramatically increase the validity and fairness of your process. And they are the only way to scale your hiring without breaking your culture or your budget. Which leads me to step 2, which is identifying core competencies, meaning the what. So before you write a single interview question, you need to know what you're testing for. This is where we move past generic skills and focus on competencies. Now, if this term is new to you, a competency is the underlying ability, skill, or trait that drives superior performance in a specific job. It's about how someone achieves their results, not just what they can achieve. Let's use the example I talked about earlier, which is B2B sales. And in this instance, let's say we have a B2B sales representative at a Series A startup. When you look at your top performing sales rep, what are the traits that separate them from the average performers? It's not just they can make a call. It's how they handle the inevitable chaos of a startup. For this role, you can identify several core competencies. For example, you could have product knowledge as a technical skill, you could have relationship building as an interpersonal skill, or you could have bias for action, which is more of a behavioral skill. So let's focus on that one, bias for action in the example. A bias for action is critical in a startup. It's really the ability to initiate and execute decisions quickly without excessive analysis or hesitation, especially when information is ambiguous, which is quite common in a startup. A B2B sales rep who waits for a perfect script will lose the deal to a rep who moves fast, even if they make a small mistake. So one thing I do recommend always is only focus on 4 to 6 must-have competencies in your interview process. If you choose 15, you will lose focus and dilute the power of your framework. Of course, you can have more than 4 to 6 competencies for the job in general, but you want to focus on the must-haves, not the nice-to-haves. Which leads me into step 3, defining competency proficiency levels. So once you have the competencies you're looking for, you must define what good looks like. And this is where a lot of companies fail and stumble. They know they want a bias for action, but they can't really explain the difference between an average employee who has it and a great employee who masters it. This is why we create a proficiency scale. First, a quick note. There is no single right definition for a competency. Your definition of bias for action will be different from a Fortune 500 company or even different than your industry competitors. That is because your company has unique requirements for speed, risk, autonomy, and other things. So what's important is that your definition is clear, it is representative of real organizational needs, and that everyone involved in the interviewing process understands it. Now let's build the scale. While the number of levels in a scale is up to the company, I prefer to keep things simple and straightforward instead of complicating things. And let's be honest, us HR people sometimes like to complicate things. So the focus should be on building a scale that makes it clear and easy to evaluate a candidate's proficiency level, not making this a theoretical and complex thing that either ends up not being used or is too confusing to interviewers. Let's use a simple 3-level scale for the competency bias for action. And let's go through these very briefly, just to give you an idea of what this could look like. So let's say the novice level is someone who waits for explicit direction, they avoid risk, and they require constant sign-off, and they report problems without offering solutions. Proficient level, which is our target for this job, is someone who takes calculated risks, independently moves opportunities forward, and they experiment with new approaches while learning quickly from any missteps. And finally, the expert level, which means someone is proactively developing new strategies for speed, they inspire others to move quickly, and they anticipate and solve problems before they arise. They're very proactive. Now, for our B2B sales rep role at this Series A startup, let's say we need a proficient level as a minimum for this role. What this does is it sets a clear, measurable bar. We might want an expert, but we need a proficient. So you need to separate here between what you need versus what is nice to have. Defining this difference avoids the unicorn trap, which is hiring for a skill level you don't actually need, which really overcomplicates the search and slows down your growth. Now let's move on to step 4. Once you have the scale in mind, it is time to set the questions. Now, with the competency defined, let's move to the technique itself. The single most effective way to predict future behavior is to ask about past behavior. This is the core principle of competency-based interviewing. And here's why. When you ask a hypothetical question, like, what would you do if a client pushed back on pricing? The candidate will give you a textbook answer that sounds great, but might not reveal anything about how they truly operate under pressure. They are giving you a theoretical answer. When you ask a competency-based question, you force them to give you an evidence-based answer. The research on this is overwhelming. The meta-analysis by Schmidt and Hunter that I mentioned earlier shows that structured behavioral interviews predict job performance with a validity correlation of around 0.51, which makes them up to 4 times more predictive of job performance than unstructured interviews. This is really the difference between guessing and knowing. Now, to get this evidence-based answer, we use the STAR model. And STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. The situation means you start your question by framing what was the context. The task is, what was the goal or objective? The action, what did that person do specifically? And this is really the most important part. And finally, the result. What were the measurable outcomes? If a candidate cannot provide a clear story under the STAR framework, they are either fabricating the story or they have not actually demonstrated that competency at the level you're looking for. Which leads me to step 5, writing the actual questions that reveal true competency. The formula for writing a high-impact competency-based question is simple. Tell me about a time when you, or a variation of it, plus a specific competency behavior. So you are asking the candidate to reflect on a time where they applied this competency and recount for you how they did so under the STAR framework. This is really the main premise of competency-based interview questions. Now, let's apply this to our B2B sales rep role and our target competency, bias for action. And remember, we are targeting the proficient level. So an example question could be, tell me about a time you had to move forward on a sales opportunity with incomplete information or significant ambiguity from the client or even internally in the company. Walk me through the situation, what immediate action you took to create momentum, and what was the final result. So why does this question work? That's because it specifically tests the proficient level, which is the ability to take calculated risk and act without perfect clarity. The red flags in an answer, meaning what a novice would say, is I waited for my manager to give me the updated specs, or I put the deal on hold until I had all the details. A green flag, meaning someone has the proficient level, could be something like, I didn't have the final budget sign-off, but I knew I couldn't wait, so I immediately scheduled a follow-up call with the CFO's gatekeeper to understand the final decision criteria. Then I created a contingency plan for 2 different budget scenarios and presented them both. The result was we closed the deal a week earlier than expected. Remember, the power is in the follow-up. If they give you a vague answer, you must drill down. What specific questions did you ask, or how did you measure that result? Don't accept surface-level answers. So this isn't really about creating a script of questions and sticking to it, but also understanding the context and drilling down and probing when you need to. The goal here is to identify if this person has the competency so you can fairly evaluate them. Now let's move to step 6, which is developing a scoring framework, or the how. A great question is only half the battle. If you don't have a clear and shared rubric, your interviewers will still default to the gut feeling. The scoring framework really removes subjective bias, and it creates a consistent evidence-based evaluation. In other words, bias for action could mean different things to different people if you don't clearly define what a good answer looks like. So let us use a clear 4-point scale that aligns with our proficiency definitions. And again, the number of points you use on a scale is also subjective to you, but I also like to keep it simple and straightforward because the last thing you want is having interviewers debating over which rating is the right one, and then that really clouds the whole evaluation process. So let's say that we have 4 different scores, okay? Below standard, developing, proficient, which is what meets our requirement, and exceptional. And you give a definition or a behavior and evidence for what each rating is. And that's where the power of a scoring framework is. You don't want to just have these labels without any context. So for example, below standard means that a candidate could not provide a relevant STAR example and they gave you a hypothetical answer, or maybe the actions they gave contradict the competency, how you define them as an organization. So if someone gives an answer that falls within those confines, then you would score them a 1. For example, if you want to score someone a proficient, which is 3/4 in this framework, then the answer could be around the candidate providing a clear STAR response, and they gave you specific details. Their actions demonstrated independent and calculated risk-taking, and they learned from the situation. And this aligns perfectly with your proficient definition. So this is an example of how you would want to use this kind of framework. For this to work well, your interviewers must score the candidate immediately after the interview. And this is based only on the specific behaviors mentioned and documented, not their overall impression. Then, all the interviewers must convene to discuss any discrepancies in scores. The final hiring decision becomes much smoother from there. You can set a minimum cumulative score for example, an average of 3.0 across all competencies, and anyone who fails below that is eliminated. And then, regardless of really if you like them or not, you move those people who pass the threshold into an actual discussion among all the hiring stakeholders to make a final decision. This system really transforms hiring from guesswork into a predictable success. So in conclusion, hiring is not magic, it is a process. And now you have these 6 steps to build a system that guarantees your hiring is much more effective and impactful. So number 1, you need to acknowledge the problem, that traditional interviews are broken. Step 2, you need to define the what, meaning what are these 4 to 6 competencies that are must-have for the role. Once you've done that, step 3 is defining what good looks like, which is creating a simple proficiency scale. In our example here was novice, proficient, or expert. Step number 4 is use the scientific method, competency-based interview questions, and commit to the star-based behavioral questions. Step 5, actually writing the questions. Use the tell me about a time when you formula or something similar. And finally, use a scoring rubric. Create a point scale and make sure that it is consistently applied amongst all your interviewers. So this is all to say, stop guessing on your next hire. Implement this framework today, and you will immediately see the impact on your team performance and your growth trajectory. I have personally helped companies hire hundreds of people using this framework. And every single time, the turnover rate went down, engagement went up, and growth accelerated. Now, as promised, for those of you who want to implement this immediately, I want to share the AI-powered interview question builder that I have built and currently use. It allows you to copy an existing job description, and it automatically suggests the core competencies, defines the proficiency levels, and generates star-based questions and a scoring rubric. It is a massive shortcut to building this entire system. You can find the link in the description below. That's all for this episode of Organized Chaos. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you on the next one.